Welcome everyone to the International Mentoring Community Mentoring Lounge, where we chat about all things mentoring, mentorship. I'm Dr. Stephen Hobbs. I am the Director of Education and Certification, and therefore I take care to make sure that all the ideas are there that link up with when you go for certification, the education certification all come together. And joining me today is
Good morning. I'm Doug Lawrence, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Practice. And with Outreach, I'm looking at things from a community perspective and how can we extend what we have today beyond where we are today, so extending the community itself. And then I'm also Director of Practice, so I have a very deep and rich mentoring practice. And the idea behind me taking on that portfolio is to get people to engage in creating their own practice and for the international mentoring community to be there as part of their support in helping them ensure success.
And so, as a segue, today we're going to be taking a look at some essential tips to master storytelling with mentees. So, for mentees, with mentees, because of mentees. But we're going to also add story sharing. And that's where we're going to go today. So, we've got the 5 tips, and we do have a bonus. And I would offer to everyone is that this is an insight. It's not, we're not going to dig deep into it like from a practice point of view. We're going to come back and do elements of that on another show. So this is not necessarily comprehensive, more illustrative, I think is the best way in which to do it. So we're sort of doing the eagle view of this. But before we dive into what is a story, what's storytelling, what's story sharing, we also do a lot of work in support of Quora questions. And Doug is the one who answers those Quora questions. So, Doug, you've got one today. You want to bring it up and what your response was to it?
I sure can. So the question that was posed is, who is an unlikely mentor and why? And it's interesting that that question came up because I do get asked a lot, where can I find a mentor? How do I get a mentor and all that? So this was a completely somewhat different, I guess is probably the best way. So who is an unlikely mentor and why? And my response to that is mentoring is a two-way trusted relational arrangement where the mentor and mentee will learn and grow together personally and professionally. It's all about building a trusted relationship and for the mentor to be able to create that safe environment for the relationship to nurture and grow. To specifically answer your question, an unlikely mentor for me would be someone that I could not make a connection with, that there was no chemistry there at all. Excuse me. I may realize partway into the mentoring relationship arrangement that this person cannot provide me with what I'm looking for. It would be time to end that relationship or that arrangement and look for someone that can provide me with what I want. What I'm finding with all the mentoring that I'm doing, paid and free, is that the ability to listen is crucial. Someone that is not a good listener would not be a good mentor for me. Sometimes all we need is to talk our way through the problems that we're dealing with.
So if you're in a workplace or something like that, and someone's assigned your mentor, if you're a mentee, it may not always work, right?
Yep, I've had that.
I've been down that road a few times.
Yeah,
And sometimes a mentee is assigned to you as a mentor, and it may not work.
yeah.
And therefore, I think to your point, there's this chemistry, this mix, this energy that is there. One has to really take a look at that, right? And I think I have to share this because of the nature of the question. One of my most unlikely mentors, and I've had ones that are like 3 minutes long, right? And I'm going to talk about this young girl, okay? Because it just popped into mind. When I was a after school recreation leader back when I was a young little whippersnapper, right? I was standing there, and this little girl, probably about 7 or 8, came up to me. And what you have to appreciate, folks, is that I'm 6'7". Okay. And she came up to me and she says, "Can I call you tall for the short of it?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, yeah, okay." But what was really great was just preceding that, she kept, "Should I go over talk to him?" You know that little hesitation that kids have to, should I go talk? Should I? Over she came. And then she bounced away, and I just went, that was like a mentoring moment, right? It wasn't even a minute. Like I've had 3-minute ones, and a mentoring moment about how insightful those you may not know who can influence you in response to your question, Doug. This young girl did that day, and I still get tickled when I remember it. And I thought it seemed apropos today. So there you go. All right. Well, Doug and I thought what we would do is we would do this exploration of story and what it means for mentoring. So I know, Doug, just from a general point of view, from a practice point of view, you do a lot of storytelling and story sharing, don't you?
Oh yeah, a
Yeah.
lot.
And how did you, just if you go back into your own history, how did you come to know about storytelling, story sharing, and then develop a practice? You don't have to go into it deeply, but just where did it come for you? Where did it come from?
I think it was natural at the beginning of all of this was that when I was in leadership positions, I would ask my employees who would come to me with a problem, I would ask questions that were based on my lived experience and try to help them start to think their way through it. But I didn't know that that's what I was doing was I didn't have a clue. Like storytelling, story sharing, yeah, I'm getting results. That's all that matters. And so that was how it for me. It started out that way, and then once I started working on mentoring and creating what that looked like and all that sort of stuff, that's when I all of a sudden realized that, uh, ooh, that's what I was doing. Now it makes sense.
Yeah, sort of sometimes you fall into it, you lean into it, you run into it, whatever you want to. And then as you start to become more aware of it, you can start to name it, and then you can start to figure out how it works and all of that. And that's, I think, a little bit about where we're going today. There's a little bit of, we're going to name it so you might understand it. And then these tips. Um, I think, though, that what we're going to do is offer something that's slightly kind of fun and unique to this whole story. So let's see what unfolds here. Uh, when I take a look at the word story, all right, I'm thinking about, it's an account of something that's imaginary or real. It's about people and events. And it's told in, like paragraphs. Sometimes it can be told in a poem, right? And I know that I've written poems in my time that sort of explain events in my life. And when I go back and read them, it's not your normal paragraphs like you do in a journal, but it's in a poem form. But what I also realize is that sometimes it's written to educate, sometimes it's written to entertain, and there's another word which sort of blends it to edutainment, right, in today's world, so that the listener, the reader, and the viewer, because now we see a lot more like videos out, and you can produce your own videos and all that. So sharing a story from that perspective. But I also think there is an element where the story can be about the past. And it's about, does that past story have anything to do with me? So if we're talking about mentor mentee kind of ideas, the mentee listening to a mentor story, it's from a past perspective, right? The mentor is sharing something. But remember, the mentee is sharing stories as well. And therefore, often the mentee is bringing a past story into the conversation, which means that if there's a past story, then there are stories about the future. And we have to pay attention to those. And sometimes they can be more imagined, where the past stories were real, and therefore this imagined story. But sometimes when we're sharing a story, it may actually be unfolding as we're going through it, and maybe the mentee has just come off a meeting in the morning, right, and is asking you questions in the afternoon about what happened in the morning. You could say that's past, I get that, but normally we think, like a year ago or something like that. But this notion of story is so important, and we weave it in to what's going on. And you made mention is that you learned about it and sharing stories as you went along, and it became really more important for you as time went by, as you came to understand what a story is. Right? That's how you looked at it, Doug?
Yeah, that's pretty much how I looked at it. And for me, it was being able to, because I had all these stories floating around inside inside my head, was how do I go about picking the right one, the one that's most relatable to what my mentee is looking for. And that's part of that storytelling journey as well.
Yeah. And that's where some of these tips are going to come from that we're going to be going over. But there's another very important point I want to make about story. All right. Is this notion of storytelling and story sharing. And folks, bear with me again. We could dive into this, but think of storytelling as story selling and story sharing as story caring. Just playing with the words a little bit. All right. And a lot of times when we tell a story, it may actually come from more of a managing the systems, and I'm telling you what needs to have happen, right? Because I'm selling you on the idea of getting it done. But it's story sharing is coming from a place of a bit more about from a caring point of view. So you're leading and connecting with the person in a caring way. Now it's a subtle, well, I get it. It's subtle. All right. But as you listen to the tips that we're going to share here, you might find that this story of storytelling and story sharing will unfold in a slightly different way for you, knowing they're complementary, and yet how might you deepen your own practice with those. And that's where, because you subscribe, oh, sorry, if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe. That you can write comments, or we can get more information to you, and we will do so, and we will dig deeper into some of these tips. But the other thing, just before I leave it, is what I find with stories, all right, is that it's words, it's images, it's sounds, and sometimes there's improvisation that goes with them. Like, notice my hands here. Every once in a while, they come up into the view. Sometimes they're down, and I'm sharing and talking and all that. But when I am sharing stories, I get more animated, and my head turns, and I lean, and I attempt to give a person a sense of sort of coming into the story with me. And sometimes I will embellish the story, but if the story is going to be true and of support of the mentee, I don't take away from the truth of the story. I just may find other ways in which to embellish it to get it come up. And let me just use, well, the tree may have been only 10 feet tall, but the tree that I might be using might be 100 feet tall. I might just embellish the tree to connect with the story. That's what I'm attempting to get at here. So let's take a look at these 5 tips that would be in support of you being able to master them for storytelling, story sharing with the mentees, for the mentees, and because of the mentees. Now, I'm going to share a story here. The queen died. The king died. That's a story. But here's another version of that story. The queen died. The king died of a broken heart. The first one is sort of more like, this is a fact. The queen died, the king died. That's a fact. But the story, to embellish it, to improvise, to bring more to it, the queen died, the king died of a broken heart. Now, I attribute this to E.M. Forster, who was a novelist, essayist in UK. He wrote several books that became movies, Howard's End, The Passage to India. Some of these are a little bit older movies, but this is what he was talking about when um, he was writing and trying to explain what story is, and bringing it to the foreground of what people are looking at. Seems someone's trying to. Can you hear that pings?
Mhm.
Yeah, someone's trying to tell me a story through Instagram right now. I love it, right? Oh, I'm asking this, I'm asking this, I'm asking this. So sometimes it happens. So I think I just turned it off, so we're okay now. So the tip that's linked to this is the following. Link the story through the words of the mentee. This is a really important tip. If you're going to share your story, find words that will link to the mentee, because when you go to add your words into it, there's enough words that that mentee can hook in and then learn these new words, these new concepts and practices to be able to get to the desired suggestion, or to find that shift. And that story blends those, because you are in a sense blending head speak and heart speak. Jim Clemmer, who is a consultant out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, speaks about this, but Nelson Mandela talked about the notion of when you use the words of, I'm going to paraphrase, the words of the mentee, you'll touch the heart. If you use your words with the mentee, you'll probably touch their head. And therefore, it's really important to weave the words that will connect with the mentee with your story, and then add yours in, and find a way in which to blend it together like a good soupy stew.
And I think what it also does is its relatability. It's
Yeah.
which is key.
Yeah, and that's important, and because when you get to relate, and it sort of comes up with another point here, um, that I'll speak to. But prior to that, I just want to go back to story, um, because a story often brings to the foreground some self-care requirements. Like when as a mentor and you're sharing your story with your mentee, there's an element of, if you listen to this will help you to take care of you, right? That you can then put it into action. So there's an element of self-care to it. And the way that I remember it is through the R in story. And the R speaks to resilience, resourcefulness, reciprocity, reliability, relevance, relatability.
Mhm.
These are elements that become important out of the story. And that story, from a self care point of view, the way that you're sharing it allows for the mentee to see a pathway open up for themselves. And I think there's another quote that I'd like to give at this point in time by Rachel Naomi Remen. I had to just look at the name there. I've got some notes here to my side. And she says, a story helps you see something familiar with new eyes. Sometimes the story that you're sharing, and you're bringing this foreground of self-care and all that, as a mentee, yeah, I understand in my background, all right, yet I'm going to see it a little differently because of how the mentor shares that story. As I've always been sharing, the mentee's story does something similar for the mentor, because their story helps you go, oh, okay, if that person's feeling that or seeing that or experiencing that, maybe that might influence my own way of thinking about how to be maybe a better mentor or better leader, right? Whatever it might be in terms of connected with it. So a story helps you see something familiar with new eyes.
And with that, I think when we, especially because you had already mentioned self-care requirements, and that's part of, as we move forward with mentoring and mental health, it's listening and hearing that the mentee's story and understanding what am I hearing and what are some of the trigger words that tell me that we need to maybe ask some more questions to determine why do you feel the way you do, and along that line.
So when you're doing it and you're listening in that way, Doug, a way to remember it is those like are related words, right? Because is this story, oh, this has a little bit of a resilience. Maybe I have to talk about resilience or resourcefulness or relatability, reliability, reciprocity, right? Relevance. It's a way to remember, how that story is touching you from the mentee, but also how you're framing it for for the mentee as a mentor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's take a look at the next one. Um, when the mentor shares a story or tells a story for the mentee, with the mentee, because of the mentee, often it's about tapping into the lived experience of the mentor because the mentee is often asked a question and you can respond through a story. All right. So there's something of a bit of a tip before I dive into a deeper one that I remembered when I was writing this one up, and it's the know. It goes like this: know the story, trust the story, break the story. And if you're going to share a story with your mentee, know that story, know the truth that's there, trust that story. But sometimes if you share it the same way with every mentee, it may not land because of the other tips that we just gone through. You may have to shift it a little bit or tell it from a slightly different perspective, or maybe the tree does go from 10 feet to 100 feet, right? You got to pay attention to. But the deeper tip here, wanting to go over, is this sharing of the story to tap into your lived experience is to encourage the mentee to tap into their own potentiality and their possibility. The potentiality for themselves, because they're there learning and being able to figure out what do I apply, and then educating back and just into that potentiality, sort of the inside out. But it's also to notice the possibility of the outside in. Is it maybe because of your story, the mentee may decide, you know what? I may actually have a broken relationship, personal or professional, with someone. And you know what? I think what you're sharing with me, it might be better that I let that go because it's not being helpful to me. And that's their decision, not that you as a mentor would ever go, you know what, you got to get rid of that person out of your life. That's not how this goes. But it's really about finding that potentiality and possibility, potentiality inside out, possibility in outside in. So the next one that I would go over, and this is a fun one for me, okay? And it's a phrase that I picked up and I used when I was doing quite a bit of work with a group. And I said to the group, I said, you've got to accept to live on moving ground, right? And I could see their head shaking, going, moving ground. The ground is it's static. And I went, no, 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 just bear with me. If you look at this from the outside in, from the galaxy, the ground, the Earth is rotating. it's moving. And they're going, oh, okay, yeah, you're pushing it a little bit. I go, okay, well, look at it from this point of view. Think about the ground as plates. It's called plate tectonics, geography, geology.
Mm-hmm.
And those plates are moving. One's going under, one's going over top, earthquakes, volcanoes, that kind of thing. And I was, oh, I see where you're going. So to accept to live on moving ground is sometimes the story has one surface level understanding, but there may be something underneath it or over top of it. And that's what I was trying to get at, is that when we're sharing, okay, And that's why as you listen to the story, the real deeper aspect of the tip here is the evidence-based learning that you as a mentee can gather in from the mentor and vice versa, right? It goes back to that sort of hearing it maybe through a different lens. And that's what becomes important is everything's moving, folks, right? And don't think that you're going to be able to nail it down and it won't move again, okay? And that's why the stories, when you go to share a story with a mentee, sometimes, right, it is going to move a little bit. And therefore, these other tips before it come into play as you come to understand it. But what is it that you're attempting to ground the person in for that moment so that they can grab that evidence and then to move from that. Now, you must have probably a really good example of where you've had to really bring a story and had to shift the story because of the ground that was on it. Worked in one place but didn't work on another place. Do you have that? Like I know I'm asking a spur of the moment. Do you have anything that you can think of at this point in time?
Not really off the top of my head. I'm
Well,
just kind
like a story that you may have shared in your life, you know, where you spent 24 years and then you went into the corporate world, but there's a story of something that told in one way, told in another. You had to sort of think through that.
well, I think one of the ones that sort of jumps to the forefront is, and it's more so from, it's mentoring to some extent, but it was from a leadership perspective, was the aspect of going from my career in the police force to the private sector and thinking that what was going to transfer with me was the processes and stuff that people use to critically think their way through things, which in fact it didn't. So, you know, it was a slow moving train in the police force from a critical thinking perspective, getting, you know, answers or getting approvals for things, and hearing all these stories about how quickly the private sector moved, thinking, yes, I'm going to get a little bit of heaven and be able to get things put into place, only to find out or realize that such was not the case, that it was as slow, if not slower, than what I had come from. And so it was making those adjustments.
So the story of the police force thinking I'll shift the story for the corporate world, but in fact, when you get to the corporate world, maybe some of the stories that were in the police force actually applied to what was going on in the corporate world and vice versa, right?
Right.
And that's the point I'm trying to get to is sometimes we have to really pay attention to what ground we are on. It is moving, and therefore, what's the story we're going to share in relation to tip 1, 2, and 3 that goes with that one. I think the next one is a way in which to bring a lot of this together, and it's from the perspective of the reasons for stories. Okay, and to be able to give you a little bit of image, one of the ways that I look at it is I'm involved with a lot of transition, helping persons transition and using mentoring from that perspective. And I always say to them, okay, you are now walking up to the door, and it has an archway, and therefore when you go to open it, sort of like here's the doorway, and what's on the other side of the door? And I go, is it a hallway, a pathway, a motorway, a runway, the Milky Way? What I'm attempting to do is to get them to, well, hang on a minute. I'm going through something from a transition point of view. What is it? Right? And to be able to know what it's about. And then if you, the person going through the transition, I'll call the mentee, shares back to me what's happening, and you're using a motorway as your story, it doesn't make sense necessarily to talk about it from a Milky Way point of view. Okay. You have to sort of then, as a mentor, because of, with, or for, is link your story up with the story that you're hearing. It goes back to the other ones that we've talked about. But here is 7 reasons for stories. And I'm not going to dive into them, right? But again, Doug, if there's something that pops out and you want to share something here, go for it, okay? So
Yeah.
the first reason is to take action. Share the story so that the person can then take an action. The next one is to lead persons into the future. Share the story. Here's an imagined future, and lead you there through the words and the images and the sounds and that. The third one would be is to inform others about who you are as an individual or as an organization. Right? We think about organization could be, it could be marketing. The individual, there's a marketing branding story there if we're talking about it from that perspective. But the stories you first share with the mentee are important because they inform the mentee about who you are. The next one is to remind people about ethical values and ethically neutral values. Fables, using fables and debunking myths and things like that. There's an element of, hang on a minute, you may have to look at this slightly different because of this, and give the person the chance to, oh, okay, so, and then ask some questions and keep sharing the story and sharing the story so that they see it unfold a little bit differently. We mentioned one already, converse about lived experience. And I shared one about, that young girl, but there's another one, my 3-minute mentor, and maybe another day I'll bring that up, and it involves a machine gun. And what I learned was patience, flexibility, and discretion off of that one. All right. It's a wonderful story, so I'll come to share that another time. To educate about knowledge, skills, and or attitudes. So it might be something knowledge, something skills, attitude, or a combination thereof. Those are reasons to tell and share stories. And the final one is to counter the sense of nasty gossip. I bring that out because of today's world, things can go right off the track really quickly, and where gossip can be of help. All right, there's some gossip, right, that you're sharing, and it can be in story form. But when you start moving as a mentor with, for, and because you're mentees, and start sharing nasty gossip or listening to nasty gossip from the mentee in story form, you have to really pay attention to that, right? And to counter any of that. And that, again, a story to counter a story. Anything in there that really, whoa, I want to share a little bit about that, Doug.
So a couple points, to inform others about who you are that you had talked about. I think from my perspective, that's where I can demonstrate credibility with my mentee. So by, taking a look at it from that. And then the last one, when you talked about the nasty gossip part, is that if that's not dealt with or addressed, what ends up happening is we create that toxic workplace where things don't go well for anyone.
Yeah, great points. Yeah. Well, I think we're heading towards the close of this mentoring lounge, so there's some base tips I want to just give to you. All right. And the first one is guide the mentees to see themselves in your story so they can share their version of the story. Think about that, folks. Guide the mentees to see themselves in your story so they can share their version of the story. And sometimes I'll stop in the story and go, do you see yourself in it? What would happen if you joined me in that story with me, and you got them into the story with you, as though all of a sudden their imagination comes to life, well, that tree was 10 feet. No, it's 100 feet. Can you see that 100-foot tree? And what I'm trying to share with you here, because it links to the message. Again, that's what I'm trying to get at. Encourage the mentees to weave into their story what matters to them. The more that you can get them to talk about what matters to them, their own hierarchy of values into the stories, and link it, right? It deepens and enriches their story, because in some ways, right, they're educating what they're learning in return to you. This is that reciprocity aspect. Third one, ensure the mentee you have established a relationship before sharing your story. You might go, well, why didn't you talk about this earlier? Well, I wanted to go through some of those other ones, but this one, pay attention to this. Before you start sharing stories about, where you come from and what you're doing and all that, I'm hoping you have established a relationship with your mentee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, sometimes the mentee starts sharing stories and you might go, I think we have to deal with that story just a little bit later. Why don't you share something else about yourself first so we can build a relationship? But you as a mentor, make sure you're in relationship before you start sharing certainly personal based stories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I can see Doug's nodding his head. And, yeah. I'm sure you've been down that road before. And the last one I would just give you is share stories for illustration, because sometimes the stories might be, if you're in the workplace and in life, is that we think of what's called the foreground. There's a foreground conversation. Let me give you an example. Is the lines and boxes of an organization chart. Or if you're just in conversation, sometimes if you take the conversation on face value, the story on face value, that's what I call foreground. But often stories also bring to you what's in the background, the white space of the organization chart between the lines and boxes. You've heard phrase reading between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in the story, there's a little bit more that you've got to sort of just dig around a little bit in for, right? So the key here is when you as a mentor because of your mentees, make sure you're clear about, is the story for the foregrounds, the story for the backgrounds, for a combination thereof,
Mm-hmm.
right? Make sure that the story is applicable because of the relationship that you have, right? As much as possible, get what matters to the mentee woven in and encourage the mentee to weave it into the stories they're sharing with you, right? And to really get the mentees to see themselves within the story. Can you get them in there with you, whether past or present? The points that have been raised already. Those are the things to be thinking about. So that's 5 tips. Okay, 6, bit of a bonus there at the end. I think, Doug, why don't we another time we can dig deep into how to create a story, right? One that you would tell, one that you would share, to give a little bit more notice to this. And that's something we can do on another mentoring lounge. I noticed there's no questions for us today. So I think we're going to be heading towards close, and it's getting to that time anyway. But as always, is there something that you want to share with everyone as a closing out?
For me, the big thing is that I encourage people that, excuse me, that have not participated in listening to the show today to come back or to view it online through YouTube and all the other channels that we push out on. And my reason for suggesting or recommending that is that story sharing, storytelling are both extremely critical pieces to a successful mentoring relationship when it comes to sharing your lived experience. So if this time didn't work for you, it's available online, and please take the time to go through and listen to these tips, as they're very meaningful, and there's lots of good information there.
Yeah, and watch the other videos on the channel. And just to remind everyone, Wednesdays, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time is when the Mentoring Lounge opens up. And today, I get to say the Mentoring Lounge is closing down for the day. So thanks again, Doug, for being with us. And to all of you, take care.